Hi, my literature students. I put together this presentation to give you a bit of context regarding the Middle Ages so you feel more prepared as we go through this unit. So the Middle Ages took place in about between the year 500 to around 1485. It started with the Anglo-Saxon conquest of England, and it ended with the ascension of King Henry VII to the English throne. So that's the time period we're working with. Just to go into some major events that were going on really quick. Before the Anglo-Saxon conquest, Britain was occupied by the Romans. The Anglo-Saxons did not conquer it all at once and suddenly. There was, settlers and stuff living in the area. They were a Germanic tribe and they practiced paganism. So by 450, they were the dominant tribe or the dominant group in the area. In 597, St. Augustine, who I believe was a monk from Ireland, arrives in Kent, and they're Catholic in Ireland, right? So he's a Catholic monk, and he appeals to the king at the time, and that kind of marks the beginning of this mass conversion of Anglo-Saxons from paganism to Christianity, and we're really going to see that reflected in the literature that we're reading. A few more major events. Around 1066, the Normans, who were a French-speaking group, conquered the area. They conquered the Anglo-Saxons. And around 1200 was when you really start to see the French or the Norman influence and the French language influence in Middle English language and the culture at the time. So we're seeing the beginning of the actual Middle English language and a shift in the kinds of literature being presented. Another thing that happened that you're probably going to see affected the literature at the time was Edward III and the Hundred Years' War with France. At the conclusion of that war, England lost all of its French territories, anything that it held in France, and that influenced the way people thought about the French and the English. And then 1485 marks the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty with the reign of King Henry VII. As far as I know, there's no particular reason why this is the marking other than they needed to find a marker to kind of like finish the era. And this is scholars after the fact, obviously. All right, so let's talk about some important developments and influences that you'll probably see influencing the literature that you're going to read. First, I want to talk about the Anglo-Saxon influence. They were a Germanic group and practiced paganism, as I mentioned before. During their time in power, Britain was also repeatedly invaded by Vikings, who also practiced a form of paganism, and that greatly influenced Anglo-Saxon culture. So if we're thinking what things might have looked like, if anybody's seen like the TV show Vikings or watched anything about these like Nordic or Germanic groups that were conquering and practicing pagan religions, this is probably what it would have looked like at that time. And even though there was this eventual shift from paganism to Christianity amongst the Anglo-Saxons, and most of the literature that was produced was Christian, considered like Christian literature, you're going to see a lot of imagery, themes, ideas that reflect the pagan history of the area. We'll also see themes of monsters, heroism, and conflict in religion, and kind of like religious themes as well. So we'll be on the lookout, especially in Beowulf. Another influence I want to talk about is the influence of Christianity. Religion really shaped literature. We'll see this push of clear Christian values and a lot of religious poems and texts. Even in the Christian texts, the pagan influence endures, as I mentioned before. There's still this kind of connection with the culture and the imagery and the symbolism that paganism kind of like created a foundation for. And another thing to keep in mind is that originally the Anglo-Saxons had no written language, and they relied completely on oral tradition to keep poems and stories alive. So when they were conquered, or actually when monks started to come and create monasteries and aid with the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity, they were the ones writing down the old Anglo-Saxon stories. So we're going to see them kind of this overtone of Christianity with this undertone of um, paganism. And note that every monk was writing books by hand, so it took ages, and they were very elaborate with, as you kind of like see in this picture, is all calligraphy, and there might have been illustrations. There's like artwork. A note on books, though. So again, this is pre-printing press. Books were initially produced in monasteries and then eventually in commercial bookmaking houses, which are funded by both the church and the royal courts. So note that only the nobility and then eventually the wealthiest non-nobles could actually afford books. So people that were just common people were not buying and reading books. Okay, and let's talk about the Norman influence. So again, 1066, the Normans come through, they're French speaking. They are now kind of overtaking the noble and aristocratic roles in the area. So French became the dominant language of the nobility. Thinking back to the fact that mostly it was only the rich that were buying books and consuming literature, the literary works were written in French and Latin. During this time, French started to kind of like trickle into Old English, and the mixture of the two, so Old English is a Germanic language and French is a Latin-based language, the two created what we know now as Middle English, and that is what Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is written in, and we'll be able to kind of like see how that influenced the language and see how it's starting to look a little bit more like the modern English that we speak today. During this time, we get the King Arthur legends as well, which is really cool. So we're going to see lots of themes of religion, faith, valor, love, and sexuality, the knights, the damsels, the dragons, the whole shebang. The other thing that was happening was that the English or England-based writers were adopting European poetic styles. So the previous way that poetry was written was starting to kind of like fall away, and these French and Italian and maybe like Latin poetic styles were starting to take hold. Lastly, we've got the Hundred Years' War. This is important because it kind of changed the way English literature was being written and how it was considered. So what happened was Edward III, who was crowned King of England 1327, was like, well, we have a bunch of French territories, we're French speaking. I have a rightful place at the French throne. And he went to war with France, and that war lasted about 100 years on and off. He obviously died sometime during that time. I don't think he ever got a place at the French throne because during this war, the English lost most of their French territories. So England and France are now completely separated. There's not really a sense of like them having stake in the other country, except that England was still largely French speaking or Middle English speaking, which is influenced by France or French. So with the loss of those French territories came a renewed pride in English heritage and identity. There was less of like, oh, we're fancy because we speak French here and we're French. It was more like, no, we are the English. And they really began to kind of like enjoy and celebrate the English language and use it to write literature, which is considered, a high art, and again, previously written in French and Latin. So again, we're going to see Chaucer writing poetry inspired by the French and Italian styles, but also it's written not in Italian or French or Latin, but in Middle English with the intention to kind of elevate the English language to be a vessel for high artistic expression. So I just want you guys to keep these moments in history and this historical context in mind as you're reading Beowulf, as you're reading Sir Gawain, or any sort of other weird text I assign you guys, and think about how that text may have been influenced by this context. Thank you for watching.